delighted to say he's got back safely, and not only that, but he's in the studio with me now. Good morning to you, Jerry.
Good morning, Paul.
Back safely, as I say, but I would say back with some kind of emotional scars, probably.
It was very emotional, I have to say. I understood it intellectually before I went out there that there was a blockade on, that this meant people weren't allowed to get goods in. But it was something else to stand in a hospital and see people who were suffering because medication and materials weren't allowed in. And in fact, on the last day, I held a young boy of 10 who, because the Israelis won't allow him out to a hospital, they won't allow the material in to treat him. I was told by the doctor he's waiting to die. And there's just something about an imposed poverty or an imposed suffering, which just makes it that wee bit more cruel.
And you were actually stopped trying to get over the border from Egypt into Gaza?
Yeah, there's very strict conditions placed by the Israelis on what's allowed in and what's not allowed into Gaza. It's a full-blown siege. And they, of course, have a deal with Egypt, and Egypt is beholden to them to some extent in terms of trade. So for some reason, the Egyptians were enforcing this thing very strictly. When we arrived at the border with the aid, which had all been cleared by the Red Cross and been cleared by the hospitals that were requiring it, we initially had all our passports stamped. We thought, this is fantastic, we're going through, and all of a sudden the shutters come down, we weren't allowed through. We had to spend the night sleeping at the border checkpoint, and eventually, after some discussions, including the production of the riot squad by the Egyptians when they told us to leave, eventually there was some more discussions, and we managed to negotiate to get 20 of us through, and most importantly, we got the aid through. Because one of the things I found in Al-Arish was there was considerable stockpiles of aid which had reached the border but had never gone across the border, and much of it had gone past its date.
So you've got through, you're coming into Gaza City. What's the impact of that when you see it for the first time?
Well, I mean, we were allowed to cross the border after nightfall, which apparently is quite common when eventually they do allow them in. They tend to send them in at nightfall. I think it's to reduce the impact. It's a very tense border, as you can imagine. There's even a no man's land between the two gates out of Egypt and into Gaza. It was only 10 feet across this. When you get across that, you're in Gaza proper. And at that point, people were clambering over themselves to hand us Palestinian flags and flowers and take photographs. And it's very, very emotional. We had a reception there. That's at Rafah, the town of Rafah. And we then drove from there in a convoy out of Rafah and up towards Gaza City along the strip. That was a couple of hours where we drove through villages, and people came out and cheered and welcomed us because the people were really desperate for this aid. We arrived then into Gaza City in the middle of the night, got into where we were staying for the night, and it was the next morning our program began, and it began with a visit to one of the largest hospitals in Gaza called Shifa Hospital. And there really the emotional battering started, because we could then see the scale of the need and really the scale of the desperation of the people that are being bashed really because somebody doesn't like the way they voted.
I mean, it's always impossible to separate the politics and the human in these situations. And it would be very naive of us to think that we're sitting here having this conversation and there are going to be people ringing in saying, well, they brought it on themselves kind of thing, But sometimes you have to try and separate those things. You were seeing human stories, not political stories.
Absolutely. This was a humanitarian aid convoy. We didn't get involved in the politics of the situation, except to the extent that you can't avoid this. This is an Israeli decision to impose these conditions, and I think it's unjust, and I think it's a crime against humanity to punish a community in such a vicious way, to withhold medicines and medication from a whole community, from children, from women.
Do these women and children understand the politics? Are they aware that this is happening because of a political situation?
Well, everyone that I spoke to, and I spoke to patients, I spoke to others, were very well aware of it. And to be honest, I've sat in the north of Ireland, and people understand where they are politically, and they understand the situation they're in. People understood that. Now, the fact is that the people of Palestine as a whole, the majority in the last election, voted for a Hamas government. I was asked constantly when I was going in by journalists and when I was there, would I be prepared to meet Hamas? And I made it perfectly clear that I would adopt the same attitude as I insisted people adopt towards Ireland. Whoever the Palestinian people vote for, I will recognise as the people they voted for. I don't have any choice. And people at one time refused to talk to Sinn Féin. Now, I don't have any particular preference who the Palestinian people choose, but whoever they choose, they choose. But primarily I was there for humanitarian purpose, to bring in aid.
Well, in the hospital, I mean, do they have medicines? Are they lacking in basics?
They're lacking in everything. They have lack of medicines, basic medicines. They can now only operate on an emergency basis. They won't do routine operations at all in Gaza. They can't give sufficient pain-killing medicine on occasions. They can't do adequate preparations before operations. One of the tragic side effects of that was I saw a man, a former headmaster, who went in for an operation on his back, funny enough, for the same injuries I have in my back. There was a problem during the operation. They're not allowed to take him out to another hospital. They don't have the equipment to fix it. He's now quadriplegic and he is dying. This is the sort of things we're seeing. We went to Khan Yunis in the south of Gaza to see the biggest hospital there. The kidney dialysis unit there, a third of the machines are not working because parts are broken. They're not allowed the spare parts. The patients there only get 2-hour sessions 3 times a week, whereas the minimum is 4-hour sessions 3 times a week. So they don't even get to feel better as some patients would after their dialysis. And the doctor said to me, he says, we're basically slowly poisoning them instead of quickly poisoning them. This is the thing, they have x-ray machines that are not working. Mammography can't be done in southern Gaza because the tubes are missing, the tubes are broken on the x-ray machines. We went to the United Nations, UNRWA. The woman in charge of the United Nations in Gaza told us they can't even get spare parts for their machinery in. It's horrendous. And she said people need to speak out about it, people need to force the Israelis to lift the blockade, and people need to visit Gaza to show people that they care about them.
When you were in the area, obviously it was an area that was involved in the very serious bombardment that went on. Is there rebuilding going on? Are they getting their homes, their buildings back together?
Well, the really horrific thing here, which is maybe not the worst thing that's happening, but it's horrific, they're not allowed cement in, so they can't rebuild. So the Israelis went in and destroyed huge swathes of the cities, huge parts of the region. The north of Gaza is pulverized, and they've destroyed schools, including, interestingly enough, the American school in Gaza was destroyed. Schools, the university, section of the university was taken out, homes all over the place destroyed, and yet they're not even allowed the cement in to rebuild them. So people there are trying to make cement out of old cement and out of old bricks that they're grinding now.
Well, did you speak to anyone who told you the logic of not allowing people to have cement?
I haven't spoken to the Israeli government, and to be honest, I would love to put this point to them on what basis they judge that, because I believe they need to explain this to the world. But there was no such explanation. It's just not on the list of things that are allowed in. They aren't allowed cement, and they can't rebuild. So they're trying to build without cement. They're trying to build with improvised cement. And of course, ingenuity is a great thing, and people there are doing all sorts of things to try to survive. And the problem is that that's not the way anybody should have to live. And it isn't enough. Even what we brought 25 ambulances. We brought a dialysis machine. We brought scores of wheelchairs. We brought over $50,000 worth of medicines. More than that, one shipment was $50,000. We also brought in software which would teach blind people how to use computers, which we gave to the United Nations School. All of this stuff we brought in is a drop in the ocean. It just doesn't even start to meet the level of need that we saw there.
If you're living in those conditions, there are only 2 options open to you: despair or anger.
Yes, and I mean I think that's a very important point, because most people. I mean, let's just be honest. Let's just imagine that one of your children was sitting there that could survive if they were either allowed out to another hospital or the material was allowed there, which you actually have the money to pay for, because although unemployment is now vastly increased because of the destruction and the blockade, people aren't destitute in the way they are in other places, and your child was to die needlessly. What would your reaction be? And I think people need to understand we are sowing the seeds of terrible, terrible conflict if we don't act as human beings and say this has to stop.
This caller here, Jim, says, fair play to you for going and taking the aid to Gaza, but he has a question. He wants to say, what Jim says is that you're a Republican, and they did put he's a Republican, and they did put his own community and our minority community through a lot of trouble for 30 or 40 years. He should have explained to the Palestinians that if they were to sit down and talk the same way the provost did here, they might well get it sorted out. We now live in a relatively peaceful country.
Well, I can tell you, and that's a very good point, and I can say that I wouldn't necessarily agree with all the nuances, but it's a very good point. But I can say that everyone I spoke to when they knew I was from Ireland were massively interested in how we had managed to get our way out of conflict. And I can tell you that even the people I met from Hamas, and I met the Prime Minister, Hania, I had the very good privilege of meeting him and having a discussion with him. He raised the issue of the peace process in Ireland and the need for peace in Gaza. And I can assure you that what they're telling us, I know that when you get into negotiations it may be different, but what they're telling us is that they're up for peace process, they're up for discussions, they're up for trying to resolve the situation. Now, I know the devil's in the detail, and we know even from our process how difficult it is. But remember, we got nowhere here until the British government eventually decided that they would talk to Sinn Féin. And I think one of the problems you have in Gaza at the moment is that Hamas, which is the elected government, is on the list of terrorist organisations, and nobody's allowed to talk to them. Now, there's a political, and to use the shorthand, there's a political and there's a military wing to that. I think that if the political wing was to be removed from that to allow people to talk to them, then at the very least we could try to do what the caller suggests, and that's absolutely right what needs to happen.
Okay, well, thanks for telling us about it, Jerry. Thank you very much, and congratulations on your trip. This Saturday, St. Colin's Cathedral are holding their summer fair.